The dust kicked up by Jake Morrison's horse settled like a golden curtain in the late afternoon sun as he approached the weathered trading post on the outskirts of Copper Creek. His leather chaps creaked with each step, and the silver spurs on his boots chimed a familiar tune that had accompanied him across 3 states and countless miles of unforgiving frontier. Jake had always prided himself on reading people, a skill that had kept him alive through cattle drives, saloon brawls, and more than one encounter with desperados. But the man sitting motionless on the porch of Henderson's General Store was unlike anyone he'd ever seen. The stranger wore a curious blend of clothing, traditional buckskin pants adorned with intricate beadwork, but paired with a worn cavalry jacket that had seen better days. His long black hair was braided with feathers and small bones, yet a pocket watch chain glinted from his vest. Most striking of all were his eyes, dark as midnight and sharp as a hawk's. They seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, his boots echoing on the wooden planks as he approached. The stranger's gaze followed him, but there was no acknowledgement, no nod of greeting that was customary among men of the West. "Afternoon," Jake said, tipping his hat. Nothing. Jake tried again, louder this time, thinking perhaps the man hadn't heard him over the wind that perpetually swept through these parts. "I said good afternoon, friend. Still nothing." The stranger's expression remained unchanged, though Jake noticed a slight tilt of his head, as if he were studying him like a puzzle to be solved. It was then that Jake remembered something his younger sister Mary had taught him years ago, back when they lived in St. Louis. She'd worked at a school for the deaf and had shown him some basic signs, insisting that communication was a bridge that could span any gap. Feeling somewhat foolish but determined to be neighborly, Jake raised his hands and slowly formed the signs for hello and friend. His movements were rusty and uncertain, but the effect was immediate and startling. The stranger's stoic mask cracked, revealing first surprise, then something that might have been amusement. He responded with fluid, graceful movements of his own hands, far more complex and rapid than Jake could follow. "Whoa there, partner," Jake said with a sheepish grin, holding up his hands in surrender. "I'm afraid that's about all the sign language this cowboy knows. You'll have to go slow with me." The stranger smiled, the first genuine expression Jake had seen from him, and began to sign more deliberately. Though Jake couldn't understand most of it, he caught a few familiar gestures and the universal language of hospitality as the man gestured toward the store and then to himself. "You're inviting me for a drink?" Jake ventured. A nod, followed by more signing that Jake interpreted as agreement. As they walked into Henderson's store together, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter was more significant than it appeared. The stranger moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to command, and other patrons in the store seemed to regard him with a mixture of respect and wariness. Old Pete Henderson, the store's grizzled owner, looked up from his ledger with obvious surprise. "Well, I'll be damned. Jake Morrison, you're about the first white man I've seen Chief Running Bear take a shine to in, must be going on 2 years now." Jake's blood ran cold. "Chief?" "Running Bear, leader of the local Lakota band," Henderson continued, seemingly oblivious to Jake's sudden pallor. "Keeps the peace around these parts, trades with us regular-like. But he don't usually socialize with outsiders, especially not cowboys," Jake finished, his mind racing. Henderson nodded, then looked between the two men with growing curiosity. "How'd you two manage to strike up a conversation anyway? Chief don't speak much English, and he sure as hell don't talk to strangers." Jake glanced at Running Bear, who was watching this exchange with those penetrating dark eyes, clearly understanding more English than he let on. The chief's expression was unreadable, but Jake sensed he was being evaluated, measured against some invisible standard. "We found a way to communicate," Jake said carefully. Running Bear stepped forward and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, a gesture that caused several other patrons to stare openly. The chief then signed something elaborate, his movements precise and purposeful. "What's he saying?" Jake asked Henderson. The old storekeeper scratched his beard. "Damned if I know. But if I were you, cowboy, I'd consider myself either very lucky or in a heap of trouble. Maybe both." As if summoned by Henderson's words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from outside, many horses moving fast. Running Bear's head snapped toward the door, his body tensing like a coiled spring. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his Colt .45, but Running Bear caught his wrist and shook his head firmly. The chief's eyes held a warning that transcended language. Not yet. The riders were getting closer, and Jake had the distinct feeling that his simple gesture of courtesy was about to thrust him into something far more complicated than a friendly drink between strangers. The thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of men riding hard with purpose. Through the dusty window of Henderson's store, Jake counted at least a dozen riders approaching in a cloud of dust and determination. Their leader, a tall man with a silver badge glinting on his vest, dismounted with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to authority. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw was a man Jake recognized by reputation, fair but unforgiving, with a mustache that had gone gray from years of dealing with frontier justice. Behind him rode a mix of deputies and what looked like concerned townspeople, all armed and wearing expressions that suggested this wasn't a social call. Running Bear remained perfectly still, but Jake could feel the tension radiating from the chief like heat from a forge. The other patrons in the store had suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, melting away through the back door with the practiced ease of people who knew when to make themselves scarce. "Henderson," Sheriff Bradshaw's voice boomed as he pushed through the front door, spurs jangling with each step. "We need to have words with your guest." The sheriff's eyes locked onto Running Bear, then shifted to Jake with obvious surprise. Well, Jake Morrison. "Didn't expect to find you here, especially not keeping such interesting company." Jake touched the brim of his hat. "Sheriff Bradshaw, just stopped in for supplies." "Supplies, eh?" Bradshaw's gaze moved between Jake and Running Bear with the calculating look of a man trying to solve a puzzle. "Funny thing, Jake. We've had reports of cattle going missing from the Williamson ranch." "Good cattle, prime breeding stock, worth a considerable sum. That's unfortunate," Jake replied carefully. "Cattle rustling's a serious business." "Indeed it is." Bradshaw stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "What's more interesting is that the tracks leading away from the Williamson spread head straight toward Lakota territory. Now, I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but when cattle disappear and the trail leads to Indian land..." Running Bear's expression remained impassive, but Jake noticed his hands had moved to a more ready position. The chief's dark eyes flicked between the sheriff and the door, calculating distances and options with the practiced assessment of a warrior. "Sheriff," Jake interjected, "seems to me you're making some mighty big assumptions based on some tracks in the dirt." Bradshaw's attention snapped back to Jake. "You defending him, Morrison?" "That's interesting, considering you two just met. Unless..." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Unless you've been in cahoots longer than appearances suggest." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight. Jake felt the weight of every eye in the room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. He was about to respond when Running Bear stepped forward and began signing with deliberate, measured movements. "What's he saying?" Bradshaw demanded of Henderson. The old storekeeper shrugged helplessly. "I don't speak sign language, Sheriff." Never had cause to learn. Jake found himself in an impossible position. He could barely understand Running Bear's signing, but he could see the chief was trying to communicate something important. More critically, he realized that his earlier gesture of friendship had somehow made him a player in a game whose rules he didn't understand. "I can make out a little," Jake said slowly, watching Running Bear's hands. "Something about cattle and..." He paused, trying to interpret the fluid movements. "Truth?" Running Bear nodded emphatically and continued signing, his movements becoming more animated. He pointed toward the hills, then made gestures that Jake interpreted as riding, followed by signs that seemed to indicate multiple people. "He's saying something about riders in the hills." Jake translated hesitantly. "More than one group, I think," Sheriff Bradshaw scoffed. "Convenient story. Indian cattle thieves claiming they saw other cattle thieves." But Jake was beginning to piece together something that made his blood run cold. Running Bear was signing about white men, armed men, moving cattle at night. The chief wasn't confessing to rustling, he was reporting it. "Sheriff," Jake said urgently, "I think he's trying to tell you who really took those cattle." Before Bradshaw could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Well, ain't this a cozy little gathering?" Everyone turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, and Jake felt his heart skip a beat. She was tall and confident, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon light and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and no small amount of mischief. She wore a practical riding dress, but the way she carried herself suggested she was equally comfortable in a ballroom or on horseback. "Miss Catherine," Sheriff Bradshaw said, clearly flustered. "This isn't really a place for a woman?" Catherine Williamson stepped fully into the store, her boots clicking on the wooden floor. "Considering it's my family's cattle that were stolen, I'd say this is exactly where I belong." Jake stared. This was Williamson's daughter? He'd heard stories about the cattle baron's headstrong child, but the stories hadn't done her justice. Catherine's gaze swept the room, taking in the tense standoff with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading dangerous situations. When her eyes met Jake's, he felt something electric pass between them, a recognition that had nothing to do with previous acquaintance and everything to do with the kind of instant connection that songs and stories were written about. "And you are?" she asked, extending a gloved hand. "Jake Morrison, ma'am." He took her hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of someone who worked with her hands. "The Jake Morrison? The one who brought in the Dalton gang single-handed?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Stories tend to grow in the telling, Miss Williamson. Catherine, please." Her smile was dazzling. "And I prefer facts to stories, which is why I'm here." She turned to Running Bear and, to everyone's amazement, began signing with fluid competency. The chief's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he responded immediately, his hands moving in rapid, complex patterns. "You speak sign language?" Jake asked, impressed despite the circumstances. "My governess was deaf," Catherine explained without taking her eyes off Running Bear. "She insisted I learn. Said communication was the foundation of civilization." The conversation between Catherine and Running Bear continued for several minutes, with the rest of the room watching in fascination. Finally, Catherine turned back to the group, her expression grim. "Gentlemen," she said, "we have a problem. And it's not Chief Running Bear." Catherine's words hung in the air like the calm before a thunderstorm. Sheriff Bradshaw shifted uncomfortably, his hand still resting on his gun belt, while Jake found himself caught between admiration for the remarkable woman before him and growing concern about what Running Bear had revealed. "What kind of problem?" Bradshaw asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. Catherine's green eyes flashed with anger. "The kind that involves my own foreman, 3 of our ranch hands, and a very elaborate scheme to steal our cattle and blame it on the Lakota." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake watched as the implications sank in around the room. Henderson whistled low under his breath, while the sheriff's face went through several shades of red. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Williamson." Bradshaw said carefully, "It's not an accusation, Sheriff. It's a fact." Catherine's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. "Chief Running Bear and his scouts have been tracking the real rustlers for 3 days. They know where our cattle are being held, and they know who's responsible." Running Bear stepped forward and began signing again, his movements urgent and precise. Catherine translated as he spoke. "He says the cattle are being held in Devil's Canyon, about 10 miles north of here. There are at least 8 men guarding them, all armed. They're planning to move the herd tomorrow night, probably to sell them across the state line." Jake's mind raced. Devil's Canyon was rough country, full of hidden passages and natural fortifications. It would be nearly impossible to approach without being seen, and even harder to get the cattle out if shooting started. "Why should we believe any of this?" Bradshaw demanded. "For all we know, this is just some elaborate story to throw us off the real trail." Catherine's eyes blazed. "Because, Sheriff, Chief Running Bear saved my life 2 years ago when my horse threw me during a storm. Because his people have never broken their word to my family. And because—" She paused, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Because I saw Bill Hutchins, my own foreman, meeting with strangers in the hills 3 nights ago, and when I asked him about it, he lied to my face." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd known Bill Hutchins by reputation, a hard man with a questionable past, but supposedly loyal to the Williamson family. If Catherine was right, then the rustling operation was being run from inside the ranch itself. "There's more," Catherine continued, turning back to Running Bear for another rapid exchange in sign language. "They're not just stealing cattle. They're trying to start a war between the ranchers and the Lakota. Every missing cow, every suspicious track, every Indian raid that gets reported, it all serves their purpose." Jake felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. They want the Lakota driven off their land. Exactly. Catherine nodded grimly. And there are men in town who would profit handsomely from that outcome. Before anyone could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from outside. Not the random shots of celebration or practice, but the rapid, purposeful firing of men in combat. Running Bear was moving before the first echo faded, his hand going to the knife at his belt. Through the window, Jake could see muzzle flashes from the hills surrounding the trading post. "Ambush!" Jake shouted, drawing his Colt .45 in one fluid motion. Sheriff Bradshaw was already moving toward the door when a bullet shattered the window above his head, sending glass cascading to the floor. "Everyone down!" Jake grabbed Catherine's arm and pulled her behind the store's heavy wooden counter, just as another volley of shots peppered the front wall. Henderson was already there, clutching an old shotgun with shaking hands. "How many?" Jake called to Running Bear, who had positioned himself near a side window. The chief held up both hands, then 3 more fingers. 13 men, at least." "They've got us surrounded," Bradshaw said grimly, reloading his pistol. Must have been watching the place, waiting for the right moment. Jake's mind raced through their options. The trading post was sturdy, but it wasn't built to withstand a prolonged siege. They had limited ammunition, and their enemies held the high ground. "There's a back way out," Henderson whispered. "Through the storeroom. Leads to a gully that runs behind the building." "They'll have that covered too," Jake replied, but he was already thinking. "Unless—" He turned to Running Bear and began the awkward process of communicating through the few signs he knew, supplemented by gestures and drawing in the dust on the floor. The chief watched intently, then nodded and began signing rapidly to Catherine. "He says there's a way," Catherine translated, her voice steady despite the bullets still flying outside. "But it's dangerous, and it requires trust." "What kind of trust?" Bradshaw asked. Running Bear looked directly at Jake and signed something that needed no translation. The chief was asking if Jake trusted him with their lives. Jake thought about the moment on the porch when he'd decided to greet a stranger with kindness instead of suspicion. That simple gesture had led them to this point, but it had also revealed a conspiracy that threatened to tear the territory apart. "I trust him," Jake said firmly. Catherine smiled, and even in the midst of the gunfight, Jake felt that electric connection again. "Then we'd better move fast. He says his warriors are already in position, but they need a distraction." "What kind of distraction?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Running Bear pointed to the front door, then to Jake, then made a gesture that was unmistakably clear. Someone needed to draw the attackers' attention while the others escaped. "I'll do it," Jake said without hesitation. "Like hell you will," Catherine shot back. "This is my fight too, and mine," added Sheriff Bradshaw, surprising everyone. "If there's corruption in my territory, it's my job to root it out." Running Bear shook his head and signed something urgent to Catherine. "He says we all go together, or we all stay together," she translated. "No one gets left behind." Jake looked around at this unlikely group, a deaf Lakota chief, a determined rancher's daughter, a stubborn sheriff, and a frightened storekeeper, and realized that sometimes the most important battles were fought not by armies, but by people who chose to stand together when everything else fell apart. "All right." "Chief," Jake said, meeting Running Bear's steady gaze. "What's the plan?" The plan, as Running Bear outlined it through a combination of sign language and crude drawings in the dirt, was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. Jake found himself simultaneously impressed by the chief's tactical thinking and wondering if they were all about to get themselves killed. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Sheriff Bradshaw said, studying the marks Running Bear had made on the floor. "We're going to create a diversion at the front, slip out the back during the confusion, circle around through the gully, and attack them from behind while your warriors hit them from the sides." Running Bear nodded and added more gestures that Catherine translated. "He says the key is timing. His men are already in position, but they need to know when we're ready. How do we signal them?" Jake asked. The chief smiled, an expression that was both reassuring and slightly predatory, and produced a small bone whistle from his vest. He demonstrated its use with a soft, haunting call that sounded remarkably like a mourning dove. "Clever," Jake admitted. "Natural sound won't alert the attackers." Another burst of gunfire reminded them that their planning time was limited. The attackers were getting bolder, moving closer to the building. Through the shattered window, Jake could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different positions. "Miss Catherine," Henderson whispered urgently, "there's something you should know. Bill Hutchins was in here yesterday, asking questions about when the supply wagons come through, how many men usually guard them. I thought it was strange at the time, but you didn't think he'd use that information to plan an ambush," Catherine finished grimly. "Don't blame yourself, Mr. Henderson. Bill fooled all of us." Jake was studying the layout of the building, mentally mapping their escape route, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. "Catherine, how many men work for your father?" "About 20, why? And how many of them would Bill Hutchins trust with something like this?" Catherine's face went pale as she understood his implication. "You think there are more of them than just the ones outside? I think we need to assume that some of the men shooting at us right now are people you've known for years." The weight of that realization settled over the group like a shroud. This wasn't just about cattle rustling anymore. It was about betrayal at the deepest level, about people who had shared meals and worked side by side now trying to kill each other. Running Bear seemed to sense the shift in mood. He moved to Catherine and signed something that made her eyes brighten slightly. He says that in his tribe, they believe that a person's true nature is revealed not in times of peace, but in moments of greatest danger. The men outside have shown who they really are. Now we get to show who we are. Jake felt a surge of admiration for both the chief's wisdom and Catherine's strength. Then let's show them. The next few minutes passed in a blur of coordinated action. Henderson created the initial distraction by accidentally knocking over a display of pots and pans near the front window, the clattering metal drawing immediate gunfire. While the attackers focused on the noise, the group slipped out through the storeroom and into the narrow gully behind the building, running. Bear led them through a maze of rocks and scrub brush, with the silent confidence of someone who knew every stone and shadow. Jake found himself impressed not just by the chief's woodcraft, but by the way Catherine moved through the rough terrain. She was clearly no pampered rancher's daughter, but someone who had spent real time in the wilderness. They had almost reached their flanking position when disaster struck. A loose rock, dislodged by Sheriff Bradshaw's boot, clattered down the slope with a sound that seemed to echo like thunder in the evening air. "There," a voice shouted from above. "In the gully." Gunfire erupted around them, bullets whining off rocks and kicking up spurts of dust. Jake grabbed Catherine and pulled her behind a boulder just as a shot splintered the wood of a dead tree inches from her head. "So much for surprise," Bradshaw muttered, checking his ammunition. But Running Bear was already moving, his bone whistle producing a series of calls that sounded like different birds. Almost immediately, answering calls echoed from the hills around them, followed by the distinctive war cries of Lakota warriors. The effect on their attackers was immediate and dramatic. The gunfire directed at the gully ceased as the rustlers found themselves under assault from multiple directions. Jake could hear shouting, confusion, and the sound of men running for their horses. "Now!" Jake shouted, rising from cover with his Colt .45 blazing. What followed was less a battle than a rout. Caught between Running Bear's warriors and the group from the trading post, the rustlers broke and ran. Some made it to their horses. Others threw down their weapons and surrendered. Within minutes, the shooting was over. Jake found himself standing in the sudden silence, his ears ringing, hardly able to believe they had survived. Catherine was beside him, her hair disheveled but her eyes bright with triumph. Running Bear emerged from the rocks like a ghost, his warriors materializing around him with the same silent efficiency. "Well," Sheriff Bradshaw said, surveying the scene, "I'd say that went better than expected." Among the captured rustlers, Jake recognized several faces, men he'd seen around town, men who had seemed like ordinary cowboys and ranch hands. The realization of how deep the conspiracy had run was sobering. "Bill Hutchins wasn't here," Catherine observed, scanning the prisoners. "He's probably back at the ranch establishing his alibi," Jake replied. "But we've got enough evidence now to—" He was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A large group of riders was coming fast from the direction of town, and for a moment Jake tensed, wondering if they were facing a second wave of attackers. But the lead rider carried a badge, and Jake recognized Deputy Marshal Williams from the territorial capital. Behind him rode what looked like half the honest men in the county. "Sheriff Bradshaw," Williams called as he dismounted. "We got your message about the rustling operation." "Looks like we missed the excitement." "Message?" Bradshaw looked confused. "I didn't send any message." Running Bear stepped forward and began signing to Catherine, who translated with a growing smile. He says he sent one of his fastest riders to the territorial capital yesterday with evidence about the rustling ring. He's been planning this for days. Jake stared at the chief with new respect. You've been 3 steps ahead of all of us from the beginning, haven't you? Running Bear's response, translated by Catherine, was simple. A good leader protects his people by thinking like his enemies, but acting like himself. As the sun set over the hills around Copper Creek, Jake found himself sitting on the porch of Henderson's trading post, watching as the last of the prisoners were loaded into wagons for transport to the territorial jail. The crisis was over, the conspiracy exposed, and peace restored to the valley. Catherine sat beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of wildflowers in her hair. So, she said, what happens now? Jake considered the question. A week ago, he had been a drifting cowboy with no particular destination in mind. Now he found himself part of something larger, a community that included not just the woman beside him, but the remarkable chief who had become an unlikely friend. I was thinking, he said carefully, that this territory could use a man who speaks a little sign language. Someone to help bridge the gap between different peoples. Catherine smiled. Are you applying for a job, Mr. Morrison? Depends on the employer, Miss Williamson. Well, she said, moving slightly closer, I happen to know that my father is looking for a new foreman. Someone trustworthy, someone who can work with all kinds of people. Sounds like an interesting opportunity. Running Bear approached them, moving with his characteristic silent grace. He signed something to Catherine, who laughed and translated. He says that sometimes the best journeys begin with a simple greeting between strangers. Jake stood and extended his hand to the chief, who clasped it firmly. Then, with careful deliberation, Jake signed the words for friend and family. Running Bear's smile was answer enough. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake Morrison realized that his wandering days were over. He had found something worth staying for, a place where a cowboy who spoke with his hands could help build bridges between worlds, where love could bloom in the most unexpected circumstances, and where the simple act of treating a stranger with kindness could change everything. The West was still wild, still dangerous, still full of challenges. But it was also full of possibilities, and Jake Morrison was ready to embrace them all.